Well, folks, Iran says that they now have enough nuclear material to build a missile, but they might not use it on Israel. They're starting to threat to use it on the United States. Where does Iran fit in Bible prophecy? Let's find out. Where does Iran fit into Bible prophecy? Well, Tim, we have reached, I think, this red line that Israel has been talking about, Prime Minister Netanyahu, years back, that Iran left continually to build nuclear enrichment, that they would eventually get a nuclear weapon. They've announced they have enough material, but as Amir Safadi says, when they announce something, it usually means they're on the next step already. So we have to assume that Iran, who funds terrorism throughout the world, has a nuclear weapon. Where does this fit in a Bible prophecy?
You know, this is a question that I think resonates in a lot of Christians' minds. As a matter of fact, at our recent annual conference, someone asked about Iran relative to the prophecy against Elam in Jeremiah chapter 49. And the prophet Jeremiah predicts or foretells of a destruction that will happen in Elam. And of course, Elam is in western Iran. It's very close to the Persian Gulf, just across the Euphrates River from Iraq and Kuwait. And so the prophet says that God is going to bring judgment against this portion of what is today Iran. But I think the principle applies that all the nations, whether it's in the Old Testament that were called out for destruction and for judgment, and even today, nations that are going to come under the curse and judgment of God are those who A, have rejected His Son, but B, have brought a curse on His chosen people, Israel. And boy, has Iran really multiplied its curse on Israel for these last 50 years.
I mean, Iran's been waging a proxy war against Israel by supporting Hezbollah, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. They're funding them. They're providing missiles and materials. Every time Israel has to go and clean out the missiles in Gaza, they're restocked within a year or two, and it's all coming from Iran. Iran wants Israel destroyed, and they say it's before the Palestinians, but if they want to drop a nuclear bomb on Israel, how is that helping the Palestinians? It's not. But if you go to Jeremiah 49 and read this judgment on Elam that God gives, He says, "Behold, I will break the bow of Elam." Now, Elam is a section of Iran today, which we call Persia. It's the southwestern section. It's along a fault line, and it's where Iran is building all their nuclear facilities. So the prophecy is, people are wondering, could it be that God will bring destruction on the Elam area? Now, as you read through it in Jeremiah 49, the bow will be broken and they'll flee from the land. And so this is where it gets confusing in the biblical picture, is how will God destroy Elam? I think the answer actually is in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Because we know that Iran at its peak of power unites with Russia and Turkey, Sudan, and some of these other Islamic nations, the Stan nations. We're seeing already in the news Putin and Erdogan and the head president of Iran meeting and constantly having many meetings. The relationship between Russia and Israel has soured greatly lately, to the fact that they're doing war games in Syria yet again, constantly threatening Israel. So I don't think that God's going to supernaturally destroy the nuclear reactors and poison Iran so the people flee out, because it's pretty obvious in Ezekiel 38 and 39 that God is going to show Himself great to the world by defeating the invaders, and one of those nations is Iran.
It certainly is. And I think there's a reason why Iran hates Israel. Every despotic regime tries to distract its people from the conditions they're living under, the repression, by pointing to a foreign enemy, somebody else who they can blame for all their troubles. That's been happening in the Middle East and most of the Arab nations since Israel was founded. Well, it may be bad here, but look at what they call out attention on the Jews and on Israel. Many of the other Arab nations are starting to realize that is a fool's game, and so they're actually allying with Israel because they recognize that Iran is even a greater threat. And this is because of the difference between Sunni and Shiite Islam. But Iran's hatred of Israel is satanically inspired. And that's exactly what God is calling out in prophecies like we just referred to in Jeremiah 49, prophecies not only against Elam, but against Babylon, against all the other nations that would come against Israel. And so the principle still applies to us today. If we do not bless Israel, bless the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then we will come under the curse of God. And yet we have been a very fickle friend, and even with regard to Iran's acquiring of nuclear material, we have not, as a nation, kept our eye on the ball or used our influence and clout to stop some of these horrors. And it's going to create an arms race throughout the Middle East that will be cataclysmic eventually.
Oh, it already has. Most people don't talk about Saudi having bought nukes from North Korea. They actually paraded them a few years ago down the block. So yeah, it's definitely happening. But what's wonderful is it doesn't matter how powerful these nations get, how much of a threat they are to Israel. God promises in Ezekiel that when it gets to be the ultimate threat, where Israel's IDF, as powerful as it is, can't hold back the enemies, God himself steps back into history. He sends down fire. He causes earthquakes. The armies turn on each other. And then he sends fire back on their nations and destroys them so that only a ninth of their people are left. So when you come against Israel, now we know that Israel is a secular nation today, but God still has a plan to bring a remnant out of it. And that's who we're trying to bless. That's who we're trying to protect. We would be called Christian Zionists because we know that one day Jesus Christ is going to return. He's going to defeat his enemies, and he's going to set up his kingdom with the capital in Jerusalem. And that's what we support. That's what we look forward to.
And that's what we are calling you to join with us in looking forward to our blessed hope.